When Dad first told us that his back pain wouldn't go away, I remember clutching my textbooks that I'd brought home from college, thinking if it's anything serious, where will the money come from? In December of 1972, a single doctor's visit could set you back the equivalent of a month's rent. By the time we got the diagnosis, advanced prostate cancer, we realized that the cost of treatment would swallow everything we had. My mother, Irene, sewed late into the night to make custom dresses for Denver's wealthiest ladies, and I worked the bakery counter before dawn to help pay for morphine and x-rays. But no matter how many hours we logged, every dollar felt like sand slipping through our fingers. Back then, there was no Medicaid in Colorado, and employer-sponsored health insurance mostly covered factory workers or government employees. We had none of that. We were self-pay patients. Every shot, every lab test, every pill had a price tag. It was easy to think, as my father did, that we'll handle it, that we won't bother strangers or ask the community for help. But the truth was, our modest savings vanished within weeks, and we found ourselves choosing between groceries and another dose of pain relief for Dad. Fast forward to today here in the United States, there are so many more safety nets if you know where to look. Under the Affordable Care Act, for example, anyone earning under 138% of the federal poverty level qualifies for Medicaid in participating states. If you need chemotherapy, there are patient assistance programs through major pharmaceutical companies, and cancer patients can apply for grants from the American Cancer Society that could cover co-pays and transportation. There are local nonprofits like the Denver Health Foundation that provide sliding-scale clinics and financial counseling. Even GoFundMe campaigns can bridge the gap when insurance falls short. But the common mistake many of us still make is believing we have to handle a medical crisis in private. We think I don't want to be a burden, or I'm the person who's supposed to take care of my family, not the other way around. Yet the reality is staying silent can cost lives. When a loved one faces a life-threatening illness, it's not a moral failing to reach out. It's a practical necessity. I'd like to share some stories I've heard from other families here in Denver. Take the Johnsons on 17th Avenue. When their youngest daughter was diagnosed with leukemia in 2018, they were overwhelmed by hospital bills and school fees. They filled out paperwork for Medicaid, joined a local church's benevolence fund, and applied for an oncology grant that saved their home from foreclosure. They said, "We realized that we were surrounded by help. We just had to say yes." Or the story of Marvin Lee, a Vietnam veteran who discovered that his VA benefits could cover not only his radiation treatments, but also his mental health counseling and physical therapy. After his prostate cancer diagnosis in 2015, Marvin joined a support group at the VA hospital, where fellow veterans helped him navigate co-pays, filed appeals for denied claims, and even drove him to appointments when his car broke down. These examples remind us of a simple lesson. The first step towards survival is admitting I can't do this alone. Rejecting help often comes from pride or fear of shame. But in medical emergencies, especially cancer, the clock is ticking. We're better off leveraging every resource available: health insurance marketplaces, local charities, veterans benefits, and community crowdfunding. Here are 3 practical tips for anyone watching who might be facing a mounting medical bill. Check your coverage options. If you're uninsured or underinsured, visit healthcare.gov during open enrollment or schedule a special enrollment period if you've lost coverage recently. Even a basic bronze plan can dramatically reduce your out-of-pocket costs for hospitalization and chemotherapy. In states that expanded Medicaid, you may qualify right now for comprehensive coverage regardless of pre-existing conditions. Tap into disease-specific assistance organizations like the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, The Pancreatic Cancer Action Network and local chapters of the American Cancer Society offer grants for transportation, lodging, and prescription copays. Make a list of national nonprofits related to your diagnosis and apply early. Some grants take weeks to process. Crowdsource. Wisely platforms like GoFundMe and Give Forward can raise thousands of dollars in days, especially when friends and neighbors share your story on social media. But to succeed, you need a clear, heartfelt message about what you need the funds for. Our family needs $5,000 to cover my mum's radiation treatments this month, rather than a vague appeal for medical expenses. Keep donors updated with photos and thank you notes to maintain momentum. When Dad passed away in January of 1973, in that rain-soaked hospital room, the finality of it all hit me like a freight train. I realized then how harsh it feels to lack options. I vowed that if I ever found myself in a position to help someone else facing medical bills, I would raise my hand immediately, no shame, no hesitation. In the next part, I'll share the heartbreaking story of how betrayal from those closest to me compounded our financial difficulties, and why recognizing early red flags in relationships can be as vital as recognizing the symptoms of a disease. When the first subtle shift happened, I barely noticed it in the day-to-day dance of our little household. It began with Alan arriving home later than usual. At first I chalked it up to his booming law practice clients always wanted just one more hour to discuss property disputes or contract negotiations. Yet where previously he showed up at 6 p.m. on the dot, now he'd come in at 800 or 900, fumbling for an excuse. The office had back-to-back consultations. Andy, so many new clients. And because I wanted so desperately to believe in him, I nodded and smiled, telling myself that this was simply the price of success in Denver's competitive legal world. But evening by evening, I found myself alone at our little kitchen table, chopping vegetables under the glare of the overhead light, half listening to the radio, watching the clock tick, past 7. Then well past 9 p.m. Those late nights began to feel less like work obligations and more like deliberate absences. I wondered, what am I doing wrong? I replayed every conversation we'd had about his busy period until I convinced myself that I'd missed some essential memo about the demands of his new cases. Next came the changes in our intimacy. A playful kiss goodbye on the forehead became a quiet, distant nod. A warm embrace after dinner grew cold with excuses about headaches or early morning meetings. I remember one particular night I'd bought his favorite coffee beans from that little roastery downtown. The beans he'd raved about just a week before, and I made us each a mocha to celebrate the end of a long day. He took one sip and said, "Thanks, honey, but I should head to bed. I've got an early start." There was no, "I love you," no lingering smile, just the soft click as he closed the bedroom door on a promise unfulfilled. In those lonely moments, I learned what people call gaslighting. My mother used the term years later, but in 1973, I didn't have the vocabulary for it. When I asked, "Is everything okay? Are you upset with me?" he'd flash that practiced half smile and say, "You're overthinking again, Andy. This is stressful for both of us." Suddenly I was the two-timer, the unstable one, the naive girl who didn't understand the realities of adulthood. And then there was Mother. Oh, how Mother shone in that apartment. She'd transformed almost overnight. Gone was the dowdy seamstress who stitched uniforms and tweaked hems for her neighbors. In her place stood a woman who smelled of jasmine perfume, who wore tailored blouses and swirled in front of the vanity mirror, admiring herself with the same pride she once reserved only for her own wedding dress. The first time I saw her in those new outfits, My heart panged with jealousy. Not for Alan's attention, though, that stung too, but for what her sudden flirtatiousness said about her. She was a woman reborn, and I was watching from the shadows. The true red flags came when Mother and Alan started disappearing together on wedding errands. They'd leave before noon on Saturdays, swapping smiles and hushed giggles in the hallway. I once followed them 2 blocks down to a florist, where they browsed arrangements together. Mother's hand resting on his arm so familiarly it made my skin crawl. When I confronted Mother later, "Why are you spending all day with him?" she'd brush me off with that motherly scold. "Don't be silly, dear. We're just planning your big day. You should be grateful." And ever the dutiful daughter, I smiled and congratulated her on her organizational prowess, all the while feeling my world tilt on its axis. These might seem like extremes, but I promise you they're all too common. In a 2019 survey by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, nearly 60% of survivors reported that their abuser first showed controlling behaviors disguised as concern or care. They'd track a partner's whereabouts to keep them safe, scrutinize every bank statement to prevent fraud, or isolate them from friends under the guise of quality time. I see now that Alan and Mother weren't inventing anything new. They were following a playbook many abusers use to entrap those they claim to love. Let me share another story, one from a support group I attended briefly in Denver. I met Lisa, a bright young woman whose boyfriend had convinced her to quit her job to focus on our relationship. At first, she relished the freedom, sleeping in lazy breakfasts, afternoon movies. But soon the money ran out. When she asked to apply for an unemployment check, he accused her of doubting his love and making our problems worse. Ultimately, she found herself without a job, without savings, and too ashamed to return to her family back east. It took months for her to build the courage to reclaim her independence, all the while fighting the guilt he'd instilled. "I gave up everything for us. Now you're just throwing it away." The most heartbreaking mistake so many of us make is ignoring those tiny alarms. We think if someone truly loves me, they'll always respect my boundaries, or this can't be abuse. He's a charming, educated man. And yet charm is one of the abuser's most potent weapons. I remember feeling proud that Mother's friends and Alan's colleagues all spoke so highly of me. "She's such a sweet girl," they'd say. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, I was collateral damage in their twisted romance. Eventually, the guilt they imposed Mother, saying I owed her obedience because she'd raised me alone, and Alan, insisting I was the wife who must behave, coalesced into a paralyzing fog. I couldn't see the escape hatch, even though it was right in front of my eyes. I silenced my own instincts because I feared being selfish. I feared being disloyal. I feared that if I spoke up, I'd lose the only family I had left. Yet the day I finally broke free of that fog was the day I realized that speaking up is not selfish, it's survival. I learned that sharing my fears with a trusted neighbor, a co-worker, or a counselor doesn't betray my strength, it affirms it. Had I confided in anyone early on, I might have spared myself months of emotional turmoil. In fact, the Denver Women's Shelter reports that 70% of women who seek help from friends or community services leave abusive relationships earlier and with less trauma. Here's what I wish I could have held in my hands back then: a checklist of warning signs, sudden secrecy, rapid changes in behavior isolation tactics, so I could say this isn't normal, a network of safe people, neighbors with extra keys, close friends I trusted with my daily whereabouts, so I wouldn't feel alone in that apartment, access to community resources, a hotline number taped to the fridge, the local shelter's pamphlet in my purse, a crisis text line contact in my diary. If you're watching this and thinking, "Grandma Andy, I wish I'd had these tools," know that you can start building them today. Share your concerns with a friend. Write down the moments that made you uncomfortable. Reach out to organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799 7233 or text START to 88788. Protecting yourself isn't a betrayal of love. It's the bravest act of self-respect you can perform. In the next segment, I'll tell you exactly how I gathered the evidence, the tapes, the documents, and turned them over to the police. We'll walk through the step-by-step process that transformed me from a frightened young woman into someone who refused to be silenced. Because when we reclaim our voice, we reclaim our power, and no one, not even those closest to us, can take that away. When I stood in the hallway of our apartment that October morning in 1973, clutching the small leather bag that held my father's watch, my savings hidden in a cookie tin, and the stolen law office key tucked in my pocket, I felt a tremor of fear so intense it almost stopped my heart. But more powerful than fear was a determined clarity. I would not let Alan and my mother's betrayal go unpunished. I had learned the hard way that in a world governed by rules, the most potent weapon I could wield was evidence, and I was determined to gather it carefully, methodically, and legally. I hesitated just long enough to press my ear to their bedroom door. Soft snores told me they were still asleep. With the dawn light slanting through the curtains, I tiptoed down the narrow hall toward Alan's office. Years later, I would learn that what I did next would form the bedrock of every successful prosecution against abusers, maintaining an unbroken chain of custody for my evidence. Alan kept a spare key to his office, buried in a potted plant in the living room. He thought I didn't notice, but I had seen him slip it in the soil so many times. I knelt beside the fern, dug out the key without disturbing a single root, and slipped it into my coat pocket. Every step of the way, I forced myself to breathe slowly, to control the pounding in my chest. I could not afford a mistake. The office door resisted at first, but then clicked open. The room smelled of leather-bound law books and old cigar smoke, a stark reminder of Alan's professional facade. I switched on the small desk lamp, careful not to wake the building's landlord, whose daughter I knew played piano upstairs. My first priority was to locate the camera, the heavy Bolex 16mm with the bright red recording light that had documented the most horrific violation of my trust. I started with the desk drawers. The top one held pens and notepads. The middle one held case files. The bottom one was locked. My grandmother used to say that locks were just puzzles waiting to be solved. And I felt my grandmother with me as I searched the surface of the desk. There, next to a pile of invoices, lay a metal letter opener. With trembling fingers, I eased it into the lock, wiggling it gently until I heard that satisfying click. Inside was the camera, along with a stack of unlabeled film reels, some half-used, some blank. My blood ran cold as I realized I was not the only young woman who'd been betrayed. These reels were evidence of a pattern of abuse. Next to the camera, I found a manila envelope stamped with our former home address. Inside were bank statements, deeds, and withdrawal slips showing how the proceeds from the sale of our little Highlands cottage had been funneled into Alan's separate account. Every dollar my mother and I had scrimped and saved the deposit for our future had vanished without a trace. I slipped the envelope into my bag alongside the reels and the bulky camera, careful not to crease any paper or scratch the film canisters. I closed the drawer, replaced the letter opener exactly as I found it, and locked the desk again. I turned off the lamp, and in that moment, the office felt impossibly large and empty. In my bag lay the evidence I needed, but for it to stand up in court, I had to preserve its integrity. I tucked the bag under my coat, checked that both my coat pocket and the bag itself felt closed and tamper-proof, and retraced my steps back to the living room. On the way out, I took a moment to open the apartment door, just a crack, listening for any sign of movement. The hallway was silent. I slipped out and gently closed the door behind me. There would be no glib bravado in how I handled this. I would treat every piece of evidence as though my life depended on it, because in a way it did. I walked 15 blocks to the nearest police precinct, my coat heavy with the weight of the camera and documents and the knowledge of what lay on those reels. I will never forget the look on Officer Ramirez's face when I set the bag down on his desk and said I need to report a crime. This is the evidence. His brow furrowed as he peered at the bulky Bolex. "You've got the originals?" he asked. I nodded, though at that moment I barely breathed. He pointed me to a room adjacent to the front desk and instructed me not to touch anything. With the help of a uniformed officer, he sealed the bag, signed his name across the tape, and wrote the date and time. October 25th, 1973, 7:42 a.m. I watched him do it, memorizing every word, every scrawl of his handwriting. This was the beginning of the chain of custody that no defense attorney could later dispute. While they processed the physical evidence, I gave my statement, the dates, the locations, the repeated abuses. I even admitted my own break-in, for which at first I expected to be arrested. Instead, the detective leaned forward and said, "We'd ask you to do the same if it were your daughter. Thank you for coming forward." It was the first moment in weeks that I felt a flicker of hope beyond the rage. They booked my mother and Alan at 10:15 a.m. that same day. By afternoon, they had retrieved the reels, dusted them for fingerprints, and sent them off to the crime lab. I later learned that our case was unusual for its time incest, and filmed abuse were almost never prosecuted because victims feared disgrace or couldn't produce hard evidence. My reels labelled only with dates and brief notes I had scrawled in pencil. 2473 bedroom became the centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. In the months that followed, I learned more about how justice works in America. I watched the Harvey Weinstein trial from the sidelines of the legal community, comparing the way his accusers had meticulously preserved emails and voicemails to our own careful handling of film reels. I realized that the same principle applied whether you were up against a Hollywood mogul or a corrupt family member. You need that unbroken chain of custody. Once you break it by deleting files, editing footage, or mishandling documents, the defense lawyer will pounce, calling your integrity into question. I also saw the mistakes many victims make. One woman I met during a support group had recorded her partner's threats on her phone, but then transferred the files to her email account, where she accidentally deleted them. When the case went to court, the defense claimed the recordings were tampered with, and the judge agreed. Without the originals, her evidence was moot. I share that story not to scare you, but to urge you always preserve the originals. Keep the master copy in a safe place, ideally with a third party like a lawyer or a friend you trust. Back them up, but never overwrite them. Never. In our case, the Denver District Attorney's Office filed charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, and distribution of child pornography, terms many lawyers hesitate to apply in a domestic context. Yet the evidence spoke for itself. At trial, the prosecutor presented the film reels in an unedited format, playing them in court. The jury sat in stunned silence as each reel showed the abuse in stark, unflinching detail. The bank documents followed, proving the financial exploitation, and my own recorded statement detailed the emotional trauma I endured. By the time the defense tried to argue lack of context or consent, the jury could see with their own eyes and hands through fingerprints that this was a calculated crime, not some family misunderstanding. My mother and Alan were convicted in December 1973. She received 5 years. He received 10. The judge's sentencing remarks still echo in my mind. No person should find betrayal in the arms of their own family. This court will not tolerate such grievous abuse. At that moment, I felt a measure of vindication, but I also felt the weight of what it meant to have my personal horror laid bare in public. I had to remind myself that justice sometimes demands exposure, but that exposure is the path to healing, not only for me, but for every survivor who hears our story and finds the courage to come forward. If you're facing an abuser today, remember these steps. Secure originals, don't rely on copies. Keep the master files or physical evidence in a tamper-evident package. Document chain of custody. Have a neutral party police officer, attorney, community advocate seal and timestamp your evidence. Consult legal aid. Early. Many states offer free or low-cost legal services to victims of domestic violence. They can guide you through filings, restraining orders, and evidence handling. Understand the charges. Know that sexual assault, kidnapping, and distribution of illicit material are felonies in every state. Don't let anyone minimize the severity of what you've endured. My dear ones, reclaiming your voice through evidence is a revolutionary act of self-respect. It is not petty or vengeful. It is the cornerstone of justice. In the next part, I'll share how I rebuilt my life once the courtroom drama ended, finding sanctuary in therapy, earning back my sense of self, and learning to trust again. Because the fight for justice does not end with a verdict. It continues in the slow work of healing and rebuilding. When I stepped out of the courtroom that chilly December afternoon in 1973, the winter air felt sharper, almost painful against my cheeks. In one sense, I had triumphed. The jury had believed me. Alan and my mother were convicted, and I held proof that no child should ever endure. But in another sense, I was unmoored, no longer a frightened girl hiding in shadows, yet not quite the woman I would become. The next challenge was quiet, but relentless. I had to piece myself back together. My first refuge was a small counselling office tucked above a pharmacy on Larimer Street. I'd found it through the Victim Witness Assistance Program, which offered free therapy to crime survivors. Dr. Helen Miller, a soft-spoken psychologist with silver-streaked hair and gentle eyes, greeted me that first morning with a cup of chamomile tea and no judgment in her voice. "Welcome, Andy," she said. "This is your space. You set the pace." I sat on the floral-patterned couch and felt a tremor of relief. I was no longer alone. In those early sessions, Dr. Miller introduced me to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. She explained that our thoughts shape our feelings. When I replayed the abuse on a loop in my mind, my heart would seize with fear. When I twisted myself into blame, it was my fault. I didn't notice I sank into shame. Together we began to catch those negative thoughts and gently replace them. If I thought I am powerless, I'd challenge it with, "I gathered evidence and went to the police. I have power." Week by week, I learned that my mind could become my ally rather than my jailer. At the same time, I stumbled upon a small EMDR eye movement desensitization and reprocessing group offered through Denver Health. I'll admit, when I first heard about watching a finger move back and forth, while I recalled the worst moments, I thought it sounded like magic and maybe a little absurd. But on that first day, as I tracked my therapist's hand with my eyes, I felt the memory of that October night lose some of its razor-sharp edges. The memory remained, of course, but its power to hijack my emotions began to soften. After several sessions, I could speak the words I was abused by people I trusted, without collapsing into tears. Another lifeline came from a women's support group at the YWCA downtown. Every Wednesday evening, half a dozen of us survivors of domestic violence, incest, and assault gathered around a chipped wood table, sharing coffee tissues and stories. There was Lisa, whose ex-husband had locked her out of her own house. Maria, a college student who fought to keep her scholarship after a campus rape. And Teresa, a retired librarian who lived with the scars of a decades-old betrayal. We were strangers when we first arrived, but the circle of chairs wove us into a tapestry of understanding. In those meetings, I realized I was not broken, only human, and that our collective strength carried me on the days I felt weak. Therapy taught me techniques for moments of acute distress. When nightmares dragged me back to that apartment, I practiced grounding. I'd touch the smooth edge of a wooden chair, name 5 things I could see, 4. I could hear, 3. I could smell, 2. I could taste, and 1 I could feel. It sounds simple, but in those dark hours, it was a lifeline that anchored me to the present. On even darker days, I wrote in a journal, jotting down memories that felt stuck in my mind, then crumpling the paper and tossing it into a release box. Writing gave me permission to externalize my pain, and physically discarding the notes felt like a small act of liberation. Community service became another route to healing. Through the Survivor Advocacy Network, I volunteered at a local hotline, answering calls from women in crisis. At first, I was terrified. Who was I to think I could help others? But as I held the phone and listened to trembling voices, I discovered that empathy born of experience is a potent gift. One night, a caller named Ruth wept for nearly 20 minutes, terrified of her boyfriend's escalating violence. All I did was say, "I believe you and you deserve safety." But afterward, she told me, that was the first time I felt seen. In seeing her courage, I saw my own worth reflected back. My self-care rituals grew from these experiences. I started walking every morning in Cheeseman Park, greeting strangers and watching the sun filter through the birch trees. I enrolled in a beginner's yoga class at the community center, where ironically the flow of breath and movement taught me to trust my body again. On Sundays, I baked a new cake recipe and invited neighbors to taste a lavender honey loaf, a spiced pumpkin bunt, a lemon ginger cookie. With every slice shared, I reclaimed pleasure, exploding one myth that trauma must forever sour joy. Slowly, as months turned into years, I noticed shifts. I slept more soundly, no longer answering phantom knocks on my bedroom door. I allowed myself to plan for the future, daydreaming about opening my own confectionery. I rediscovered laughter, the deep, belly-shaking kind that I feared I'd lost forever. I didn't discard the memories, they remained as chapters in my story, but they no longer defined the narrative's tone. One afternoon in 1976, Dr. Miller handed me a small certificate marking graduation from PTSD recovery program. I laughed through tears as I pinned it above my desk next to a photo of my father in his bus driver uniform. She hugged me and said, "Andy, you have earned the right to build a new life." And so I did. In that new life, I channeled my energy into community outreach. I spoke at high schools about recognizing emotional abuse, drawing from my own journey, and students sat wide-eyed as I shared practical tips. Trust your gut. Keep a safe friend contact. Document the facts. I partnered with local nonprofits to distribute bracelets engraved with the hotline number and bullet journals labeled Safe Space. Each act of advocacy knitted another thread of purpose into my heart. Eventually, I felt ready to welcome love back into my life, not as a replacement for family, but as a partnership rooted in respect. When Matthew walked into the Alpine Chalet in Aspen in the summer of 1976, I was serving a table of tourists. He asked for a slice of chocolate ganache cake. I recommended our signature. When he returned the next evening to ask if I'd join him for coffee after my shift, I paused, measured my fear, and said yes. Over cups of cinnamon-spiced mochas, we talked about everything law. His baking, mine family, ours. He listened in a way I'd never known. His blue eyes steady, his questions gentle. He asked about my past, once respectfully. And when I told him, he simply said, "Thank you for trusting me." No pity, no awkward distance, just empathy and a promise of safety. In the years since, my journey from victim to survivor has been woven into every facet of my life. In the therapy sessions that saved me, in the friendships that fortified me, in the advocacy that empowered me, and ultimately in the love that restored me. I carry my scars like medals of survival reminders that even the deepest wounds can yield new strength. In the next segment, I'll share how I transformed that strength into the Sweet Beginnings confectionery, how I built a business from the ground up, infused with lessons of resilience and community, and how every sprinkle of sugar became a symbol of hope. When I first walked into the small storefront on Lincoln Avenue in Chicago in the spring of 1983, the old neon sign flickered its last sputters of orange light as though cheering me on. I had scraped together every penny from the savings I'd hidden in that cookie tin during my years in Aspen, and I'd convinced a local lender that a bakery run by a traumatized young woman was a sound investment. What I lacked in business experience I made up for with recipes honed in the Alpine chalet kitchens and a fierce determination to build something beautiful from the wreckage of my past. On opening day, I hung a simple banner, Sweet Beginnings Confectionery. Underneath, in cursive chalk, home of the Highland Heather scones. I chose that name deliberately, Highland, for the little cottage my father and I had once called home, and heather for the blossom that thrives on rocky hillsides, bending but not breaking. My first customers trickled in a retired schoolteacher, a mail carrier, who said my lemon bars reminded him of his mother's cooking a young couple on their way to work. I smiled at each of them as though they were old friends, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of joy. The early months were brutal. I arrived at 4:00 a.m. to mix dough, scrambled eggs, and boil jams. I closed shop at 7:00 p.m. after cleaning floors and tallying the day's receipts. My back ached, the same back that had ached my father before me, and my hands bore the faint scars of too many pastry knives. But every time a customer bit into a perfect chocolate truffle, or tearfully hugged me after tasting the cherry almond tart, I felt my purpose solidify. This was more than food, it was comfort connection, a reminder that sweetness can follow suffering. Around that same time, I revisited the cupcake boom of the early 2000s, through articles and case studies, how small bakeries across the country rode a wave of nostalgia and personalized treats to national attention. Though Sweet Beginnings predated that trend by decades, I adopted its lessons: creative flavors, thoughtful packaging, a story behind each item. I introduced the Resilience Red Velvet with a rose-white swirl for Valentine's Day and the Phoenix Fruitcake at Christmas, a tongue-in-cheek nod to rising from ashes. Customers loved the backstory, and my little bakery began to thrive. We even made the local Tribune's top 10 hidden gems list, a point of pride I shared with the whole neighborhood. Meanwhile, at home, Matthew and I navigated parenthood with the same care I'd poured into my pastries. He never pressured me to choose between my business and our family. Instead, he reorganized his law practice so that I could close the shop early on Wednesdays to take Anthony and Rebecca to music lessons. On weekends, he set up a folding table in the shop's back room, where Paul and Luke would draw cake art while I iced cookies. Over flour-dusted countertops, we built memories rather than fears. Over buttercream icing, we learned that partnership means lifting each other up when life gets messy. I think back to how different my relationships had once been. With Alan, control was disguised as love. Every late-night absence was excused as practice making perfect, every manipulation dressed in legal-sounding rationales. With Matthew, respect was the foundation. He checked in on my daily sales, then let me make my own decisions. He celebrated my wins, a feature in a foodie magazine, a big catering order. And he comforted my losses, a burnt batch of croissants, a tough week of slow foot traffic. In choosing a partner, I learnt to value emotional availability over grand gestures, to seek someone who offers empathy rather than authority. As the years went on, I realized that sustainable success, whether in business or in life, depends on planning for the unexpected. In 1985, after a particularly icy winter flooded our basement, I sat down with my accountant and set up an emergency fund equal to 3 months of expenses. I purchased a small insurance rider to protect my ovens and storefront against fire or theft. I even opened a retirement account, a concept that had seemed ridiculous when I was 20. How could I think about retirement when I was still fighting for survival? But creating those cushions gave me peace of mind. If disaster struck, I would not have to start from zero again. Work-life balance became another cornerstone. I instituted Sundays off closing the shop midday, so Matthew and I could host a casual brunch, a tradition we still keep even now that the children are grown. I hired and trained 3 junior bakers, teaching them not only recipes, but also the importance of self-care, taking breaks, stretching sore arms, and speaking up if the work ever felt overwhelming. By mentoring others, I honored the guidance I'd received from Dr. Miller and the YWCA group, passing on practical resilience strategies that extend beyond pastry. Self-care for me also meant preserving small daily pleasures. A morning walk along Lake Michigan before the shop opened, a cup of spiced chai at the next-door cafe while reviewing orders, a weekly yoga class at the local studio. I journaled each evening 3 things I was grateful for that day, 3 things I learned, and one goal for tomorrow. These rituals anchored me in the present, reminding me that sweetness isn't only in confections, but also in moments of calm reflection and human connection. Through the decades, Sweet Beginnings expanded to 3 locations across Chicago, Lakeview, Andersonville, and River North. But we never lost our personal touch. I still handwrite a thank you note for each wedding cake, and I sit at the front counter every Tuesday afternoon, chatting with regulars about their week. Because resilience isn't built in isolation, it's forged in community. In our home, celebrating milestones became our way of giving thanks. When Anthony passed the bar exam in 2001, we threw a surprise party with an oversized legal eagle cake shaped like a gavel. When Rebecca graduated from culinary school in 2005, she recreated my original Highland heather scone recipe for her friends, and tears sprang to my eyes as I tasted her first batch. Each accomplishment, big or small, felt like a victory over that October morning when my life's narrative had seemed irreparably broken. Looking back, I see that the greatest lesson of all is this: adversity doesn't define our destiny. Our response does. I could have let Alan and Mother's betrayal imprison me forever, but instead I channeled my pain into purpose. I built a business that nourished bodies and souls. I chose a partner who honored my autonomy. I created plans and safeguards to protect my hard-won stability, and I cultivated rituals that filled my days with joy, gratitude, and connection. So to anyone watching who feels overwhelmed by the chaos of loss, betrayal, or trauma, know this: you too can build something beautiful from the fragments of your past. Start with one small step, whether it's jotting down a gratitude list, reaching out to a mentor, or experimenting with a simple recipe that brings you comfort. Nurture your community. Share a meal, a kind word, a listening ear. Plan for your future. Save a little, protect what matters, and create space for rest. And above all, believe that each day offers a fresh chance to rise again. I am living proof that the hardest endings can become the sweetest beginnings.